Jack found the note on the kitchen table, and signed, in a hand that wasn't Josie's, telling him plainly that the girl who paid his bill would stay safe only if he stopped digging into Caleb Rusk's business. He didn't waste a minute being afraid. He wasted it being furious, and then he put the fury to use. Tom had the horses saddled before Jack finished reading the note twice. Sheriff Walker joined them at the edge of town, and together they tracked fresh hoofprints west, toward an old line shack on the far edge of the Rusk property that hadn't seen regular use in years. The line shack smelled of dust and old smoke, one lantern throwing long shadows across walls nobody had bothered to patch in years. Josie had been working at the ropes around her wrists since the moment they tied her, twisting her hands slow and steady so the men guarding her wouldn't notice the give in the knot, using the same patience she'd used counting $7 twice on a Sunday night. She had them nearly loose when Caleb stepped into the shack, his polished manners gone, replaced by something colder. "Your father's papers," he said. "Where are they?" "Somewhere you'll never find them." "You'll tell me eventually." "I won't." She held his stare without flinching, though her hands were shaking behind her back. "You can steal cattle and forge every bill of sale in the territory, but you can't force honesty out of somebody who's decided not to give it." Outside, hoofbeats broke the quiet, 3 riders coming in hard and fast enough to scatter the horses tied near the corral. Caleb's men scattered to meet them, shouting orders that overlapped into confusion, and gunfire cracked through the dark within seconds. Tom drew 2 of Caleb's riders wide toward the tree line with a whoop and a string of curses meant to pull their attention, while Sheriff Walker moved in low from the far side of the shack, keeping to the shadow of the corral fence. Jack came through the door with his pistol drawn and found Caleb holding Josie by the arm, using her as a shield between them. "Let her go," Jack said. "This is between you and me. It always was." "Is it? You've got the land, the cattle, the name everybody trusts. I've got nothing but what I've built with my own hands while you sat on what your father gave you." Caleb's grip tightened. "Draw on me, Mercer. Give the sheriff a reason to bury this whole mess with you in it. I'm not going to shoot a man who's already lost." Josie used the half-second of confusion that followed to drive her elbow hard into Caleb's ribs and twist free, and Sheriff Walker was through the door a heartbeat later with his gun already leveled. "It's over, Rusk. Drop it." Caleb looked at the papers Josie had never actually brought with her, at the sheriff's steady aim, at Jack standing calm and unarmed of any need to prove himself, and he understood there was nothing left to threaten his way out of. He dropped the weapon. Frank called her into the back room before the breakfast crowd arrived. He didn't sit down, which told Josie everything before he opened his mouth. "You embarrassed me in front of a full house," he said. "Paying a stranger's bill like you run this place instead of me." "I stopped a man from being run out of town over $7, Josie said. "That's not embarrassing. That's decent. It's against how I run my business. Waitresses don't hand out charity on my dime, even if it's their own money doing the handing." Frank untied his apron off the hook and held it out to her. "I can't have people thinking they can eat here free if they cry poor loud enough." Josie took the apron because there was no use arguing with a man who'd already made up his mind. Wade snickered from the doorway as she gathered her few things, and she made herself walk past him without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. She walked home along the dry, rutted road with the sun already climbing hot over Red Willow, and by the time she reached the small house she shared with her father, she'd stopped being angry and started being afraid of what she'd tell him. Hank Turner was mending a hinge on the porch when she came up the path, and he read her face the way he always did. "You're home early." "I got fired." He set down his tools slowly. "For what?" She told him. "All of it." The stranger, the empty pockets, Frank's temper, the $7 gone from the coffee tin she'd been filling for months. She waited for him to be disappointed in her. Instead, Hank rubbed the gray stubble on his jaw and said, "Do you regret it?" "No." "Then you didn't lose the money. You spent it." He picked his tools back up. $7 can feed us for a week if we're careful. But it doesn't feed a man's pride once it's been stomped on in front of a room full of strangers. You gave him something that costs more than money, and I'm not sorry you did it, even if we go hungry a little this month. Hank went back to the hinge he'd been mending, and Josie sat down on the porch step beside him, watching the sun climb higher over the flat, dry country that had never given their family much and had never quite taken everything either. She thought about the coffee tin now sitting light in the cupboard, about the boots she'd meant to buy him before the first frost. She thought, too, about the stranger's face when she'd set the coins down, and found she still didn't regret it, not even with her stomach tight over how they'd manage the coming weeks. "You're awful quiet for someone who just told me she doesn't regret anything," Hank said without looking up from his work. "I'm doing arithmetic," Josie admitted. Wondering how far $7 would have stretched. "Further than your pride would have, if you'd let that man walk out of Doyle's ashamed in front of the whole town." Hank set the hinge in place and tested it with his thumb. "We'll manage. We always have." Miles away, at a ranch house bigger than half the buildings in Red Willow put together, the stranger from Frank Doyle's eating house reached under his bed for a coat he'd left hanging there and found his wallet and money pouch exactly where he'd set them the night before he rode out. He stood there a long moment, turning the leather wallet over in his hand. The waitress had told the truth. Every word of it. And the whole town had laughed at him for it. He called for his foreman. "Tom. I need you to find someone for me." "Who?" "A waitress at Doyle's eating house. Name's Josie Turner." Tom Bennett had worked for Jack Mercer long enough to know when his employer was serious and when he was joking, and there was nothing playful in the way Jack said the name. It didn't take Tom long to learn that Josie Turner had already lost her job over the very kindness Jack was asking about. "She paid your bill," Tom said when he reported back, and Doyle fired her the next morning for it. Jack's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went hard. "Over $7. Over $7. Before Jack could say more, his older brother Earl came through the office door with a ledger under his arm and a frown already in place. "We've got a problem with the herd," Earl said. "3 head missing from the north pasture, and one of the steers that turned up near the Rusk line doesn't look right." "Doesn't look right how?" "The brand." Earl set the ledger on the desk and pointed to a rough sketch he'd made of the mark. "It's close to ours. Close enough to fool a man who isn't looking careful. But it isn't ours." Tom leaned over the desk to study the sketch himself, arms crossed. "Man doesn't run a Circle M brand crooked by accident, Jack. Every rancher in this territory registers his mark down at the county office precisely so nobody can claim confusion later. A brand book exists for a reason. If somebody's running that iron different, they know exactly what they're doing. A brand wasn't just a mark burned into a hide for decoration. In cattle country, it was proof of ownership, the difference between a man's livelihood and a stranger's profit, and every rancher in the territory knew it. If someone was altering Mercer brands, they weren't just stealing cattle. They were stealing a name that had taken Jack's father 20 years to build. Jack studied the sketch for a long time. "That's not a mistake. Someone changed my brand on purpose." Earl folded his arms. "Caleb Rusk's land borders ours on that side. I know whose land it borders." Jack set the ledger down. "But I'm not accusing a man of theft on the strength of one crooked line in a drawing. Keep watching the herd." Quietly. Out in the yard, a rider was already dismounting, a tall man in a fine dark coat, his mustache neatly trimmed, his boots too clean for a man who claimed to spend his days on horseback. Caleb Rusk had a way of showing up in town at exactly the moment people were talking about him, as if he could smell his own name on the wind. He tipped his hat toward the ranch house with a smile that never reached his eyes, and rode on toward Red Willow without stopping. Tom watched him go through the window too, and shook his head slowly. Man rides a horse that's never pulled a plow or roped a steer in its life. Rusk talks about ranching like a schoolbook he memorized instead of a life he's lived. He's still a neighbor, Jack said. Until I've got proof otherwise, he stays one. You're a more patient man than I am. Jack watched him go from the window. He had a town full of trouble waiting for him and a waitress he owed a debt he intended to pay properly. He decided to start with the one he could still make right. The days after losing her job at Doyle's settled into a new, harder rhythm. Josie found a few days' work helping her father repair fences for a neighbor, and she was elbow-deep in wire and mud, her sleeves rolled past her elbows and her hair coming loose from its pins, when a familiar voice made her look up. "Careful with that post. It'll take your finger off." She turned and found the stranger from Doyle standing at the fence line, dressed the same as before. Dusty shirt, worn boots, no sign of the fortune Tom Bennett hadn't yet told her about. "You," she said. "Come to pay me back." "Something like that." "I don't need it." She went back to the wire. "I didn't do it so you'd owe me." "I know." He picked up the end of the wire she was struggling with and held it steady without being asked. "That's exactly why I came." "You're doing that wrong," Josie said, watching him wrap the wire. "I've strung more fence than you've got years on this earth." "Then you're doing it wrong on purpose, which is worse." She took the wire from his hands and showed him the twist she meant, and he watched her fingers work it instead of the fence, which she pretended not to notice. "You're a hard woman to impress," he said. "I'm an easy woman to fool, apparently, since I spent a week feeding a man who let me believe he owned nothing but the dust on his boots. I never lied about what I owned. You just let me guess wrong and didn't correct me." She handed the wire back to him, close enough that their hands brushed, and neither of them pulled away as quick as good sense might have suggested. "That's its own kind of lying, Jack Mercer, or whatever your name turns out to be." They worked the fence line together for the better part of an hour, and Josie found herself laughing despite her best efforts not to. He didn't talk like a drifter. He knew things about cattle and land and weather that no ordinary cowboy passing through would bother to learn, and every time she asked where he'd picked up such knowledge, he answered her question with another question until she gave up trying. "You never told me your name," she finally said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Jack." "Jack what?" He hesitated only a second. "Mercer." Something in his voice made her look at him twice. She didn't know the name yet, not the way the rest of the territory did, but she filed it away the same way she filed away everything that didn't quite add up about him. From the road behind them, Wade Collins rode past slow enough to stare, his eyes narrowing on the stranger crouched at Hank Turner's fence line like he had nothing better to do than help a fired waitress mend wire. Wade had seen this man once before, humiliated at Doyle's table with empty pockets. Now here he was again, easy and comfortable, handling a spool of wire like a man who'd done it his whole life. Wade didn't say anything. But he remembered the face. Caleb Rusk found Josie outside the general store 2 days later, and he greeted her with the kind of polished manners that made her want to check her pockets afterward. "Miss Turner. I hear you've made a new friend." "I don't believe I caught your name," Josie said, though she'd heard it plenty by now. "Caleb Rusk. I own the spread west of the Mercer land." He smiled. "Jack Mercer's an interesting man to spend your afternoons with. Did he happen to mention what he does for a living?" "He didn't say much of anything," Josie said, which was true enough, and she had no intention of handing a stranger more than that. "Was there something you wanted, Mr. Rusk?" "Only to be neighborly." His eyes moved past her, toward the small house where Hank Turner was known to keep old paperwork from a land claim decades back. "Your father's lived here a long while, hasn't he? Man like that must have all sorts of old records lying around. You'd have to ask him." Josie kept her voice even, though something about the way Caleb's eyes lingered on the fence line behind the store, freshly strung with wire that carried small metal barbs along its length, made her uneasy. Fencing like that was newer to this stretch of the territory, and it had already started arguments between ranchers who wanted their grazing land marked plain and neighbors who'd once let their cattle wander freely between properties without a second thought. "Interesting choice, wire like that," Caleb said, following her gaze. "Cuts both ways. Keeps a man's cattle in. Keeps his neighbors out. I imagine it'll cause plenty of trouble before the territories through arguing about who owns what." "Perhaps I will." Caleb touched the brim of his hat and rode off, and Josie stood there a moment longer than she meant to, turning his questions over the way she'd turn over a coin to check if it was counterfeit. That evening, Tom Bennett rode out to warn Jack that Caleb had been asking around Red Willow about Hank Turner's old papers, and Earl arrived not long after with worse news: another 2 head of cattle gone, both bearing that same crooked brand. "He's not just after the land," Earl said. "He's building a case. Forged bills of sale, altered brands, and now he's sniffing around anything Hank Turner might have that could tie old boundary lines to your family's claim." "He's not just building a case against you," Tom added. "He's mapping out every soft spot in this territory. Old land claims, small ranchers who can't afford a lawyer, a girl who just lost her job and might be angry enough at you to talk. Man like that doesn't waste a single conversation." Jack said nothing for a long moment. He was thinking less about the cattle and more about the fact that Caleb Rusk now knew Josie's name. The next time Jack rode into town, Josie was waiting for him on the porch, arms crossed, her patience clearly used up. "Jack Mercer," she said. "Is that really your name?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than any answer could have. "It's my name," Jack said. "All of it's true. I just didn't tell you everything that comes with it." "Then tell me now." So he did. The ranch that stretched further than she could ride in a day. The freight contracts, the herds, the Mercer name that half the territory recognized on sight. Every dollar he'd never once mentioned while she was pulling wire out of the mud beside him. Josie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You let me believe you were broke. I let you help a man before you knew what he had. That's not the same as lying. It feels the same from where I'm standing." She stepped back from him. "Were you testing me, Jack? Waiting to see if I'd start looking at you different once you told me the truth?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence was its own confession. "You were," she said quietly. "You wanted to know if kindness only shows up when there's nothing to gain from it. Josie. I paid $7 for a hungry man. I didn't buy a place in your life, and I didn't sign up to be studied like one of your cattle brands." She walked back toward the house, and this time he didn't follow. Josie shut the door behind her and stood in the front room with her back against it, listening to her own breath. She had spent years telling herself that leaning on nobody kept a person safe. Nobody could take away what you never let yourself need. And here was proof, plain as daylight, that trusting a man who looked ordinary had cost her a piece of her own certainty, the same way it had once cost her a week's wages. Through the window she watched Jack standing in the yard, not moving, and some small, stubborn part of her wanted to walk back out and tell him it didn't matter, that ranches and cattle and freight lines changed nothing about the man who'd knelt in the mud helping her string wire. She didn't walk back out. Not yet. Jack stood in the yard a long while after she'd gone, turning the truth over the same way she had. Money could buy land and cattle and comfort. It had never once bought him a person's honest trust, and he was starting to understand why. He remembered Earl's warning from weeks earlier, about what happens once a woman learns what a man is worth, and understood now that Earl had gotten it only half right. It wasn't Josie's opinion of him that had changed. It was his own certainty, the wall he'd built out of a lifetime spent wondering who wanted him and who wanted his name, and he'd let that wall stand even with a woman who'd never once asked him for a thing. News of the argument reached Red Willow faster than either of them expected, carried mostly by Wade, who'd seen the whole thing from across the street and couldn't resist repeating it at Doyle's that evening. By the next morning, it had reached Caleb Rusk too, and he smiled when he heard it. "So Miss Turner's angry with Mercer," he said to no one in particular. Then she's exactly where I need her. Josie hadn't spoken to Jack in 4 days when she remembered something that had been nagging at the edge of her thoughts since the fence line. Wade had been talking loudly at Doyle's about a group of cattle being driven south at night, laughing about it like it was nothing more than gossip. She didn't want to help Jack Mercer with anything. But she also didn't want a thief walking free because she'd been too proud to mention it. She found Tom Bennett at the livery and told him what she'd heard. Tom rode straight to Jack with it, and by nightfall Jack, Tom, and Sheriff Ben Walker had ridden out to the old trail south of the Rusk line, where they found fresh cattle tracks and, further along, a steer with a brand that had clearly been reworked with a running iron, the crooked lines Earl had sketched weeks earlier, burned into a hide that should have carried the Mercer mark clean and whole. Tom crouched beside the steer, running a thumb along the scarred hide. Folks who've never worked cattle think rustling's just stealing supper on the hoof. It isn't. A man's whole herd is his savings account, his bank, and his future all walking around on 4 legs. Steal one animal quiet enough, and change its brand clean enough, and you've stolen a piece of another man's life without him ever seeing your face. Sheriff Walker crouched beside the animal and studied the brand for a long time. This wasn't an accident. Somebody took time and care doing this. Care enough to make it look legal, Jack said. Which means there's paper somewhere backing it up. Bills of sale. Forged, but official looking. Caleb didn't wait for the sheriff to come to him. He rode into Red Willow first and stood in the street loud enough for half the town to hear, accusing Jack Mercer of using his wealth to bully smaller ranchers and now trying to pin his own bad bookkeeping on an honest neighbor. It worked, for a day. Whispers followed Jack down the street that hadn't followed him in years, the same kind of doubting looks that had once been aimed at a broke stranger who couldn't pay for his supper. Funny thing about this town, Tom said dryly, watching the whispers follow Jack down the boardwalk. Took you a week to prove you weren't a broke cowboy, and about a day to prove you weren't a crook either. Man can't win around here without somebody doubting him twice. I've noticed, Jack said. Josie heard the talk too, and despite everything, she found she couldn't stomach watching a man be wrongly accused twice in the same town. She walked up to Jack outside the general store, ignoring the stares. My father has old land papers. Boundary records from before the war. If Caleb's forging bills of sale to claim land that was never his, those old papers might prove it. Jack studied her carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because it's the truth, and I still believe in it, even when I'm angry with you. Caleb Rusk didn't waste time once he understood what Hank Turner was sitting on. 2 of his men rode out to the Turner house after dark, asking Hank to hand over any old land papers, for safekeeping, in a tone that made it clear refusal wasn't really an option they expected him to take. Hank refused anyway. These papers belong to my father, he said, standing in his own doorway with a shotgun he hadn't fired in years but knew how to hold steady. They'll stay in this house. Josie hid the documents inside a hollowed-out feed sack before the men could search the place, and by the time Sheriff Walker arrived, alerted by a neighbor who'd heard raised voices, Caleb's men had already ridden off empty-handed, muttering threats that Josie didn't like the sound of one bit. Jack arrived not long after the sheriff, and this time there was no pretense left between them, no careful distance. He looked at Hank's doorway, at the shotgun still in the older man's hands, and understood exactly how close the danger had come to Josie's family because of him. I'm moving you both somewhere safer until this is settled, he said. You don't get to decide that for us, Josie said, though there wasn't much fight left in her voice. No. But I'm asking. He looked at her, and for the first time since the fence line, some of the careful distance between them fell away. I should have told you everything from the start. Not to test you. Just because you deserved the truth plainly, the way you gave it to me that first night. I know, Josie said. I'm still deciding if I forgive you for it. That's fair. She almost smiled despite everything. You promise you'll keep my father safe? I promise. I don't need a promise from a rich man with an army of ranch hands, she said. I need one from Jack. Just Jack. Then that's the one I'm giving you. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, slow enough that she could have stopped him and didn't. For a moment neither of them said anything at all, the porch lamp throwing soft light across the space between them, the night gone quiet except for the horses shifting in the yard. I've met plenty of people who wanted something from me, Jack said quietly. You're the first one who ever gave something to me first, before you had any reason to. Don't make me out to be better than I am, Josie said, though she didn't step back. I was just doing what my father raised me to do. Maybe. But you're still the reason I want to be a better man than the one who let a whole town believe he was broke rather than tell one honest woman the truth. They stood there a moment longer than either of them meant to, and for the first time since the eating house, the space between them felt like something worth closing rather than something to guard. He almost kissed her then, and she almost let him, but Hank's voice came through the open window asking if anybody planned on helping him board up the back window before Caleb's men decided to try again, and the moment passed the way moments do on a night when danger is still too close to trust entirely. Jack settled for pressing his forehead briefly against hers, a promise neither of them said aloud, before turning back to help Hank with the window. Before sunrise, Josie was gone. Jack found the note on the kitchen table, and signed, in a hand that wasn't Josie's, telling him plainly that the girl who paid his bill would stay safe only if he stopped digging into Caleb Rusk's business. He didn't waste a minute being afraid. He wasted it being furious, and then he put the fury to use. Tom had the horses saddled before Jack finished reading the note twice. Sheriff Walker joined them at the edge of town, and together they tracked fresh hoofprints west, toward an old line shack on the far edge of the Rusk property that hadn't seen regular use in years. The line shack smelled of dust and old smoke, one lantern throwing long shadows across walls nobody had bothered to patch in years. Josie had been working at the ropes around her wrists since the moment they tied her, twisting her hands slow and steady so the men guarding her wouldn't notice the give in the knot, using the same patience she'd used counting $7 twice on a Sunday night. She had them nearly loose when Caleb stepped into the shack, his polished manners gone, replaced by something colder. Your father's papers, he said. Where are they? Somewhere you'll never find them. You'll tell me eventually. I won't. She held his stare without flinching, though her hands were shaking behind her back. You can steal cattle and forge every bill of sale in the territory, but you can't force honesty out of somebody who's decided not to give it. Outside, hoofbeats broke the quiet, 3 riders coming in hard and fast enough to scatter the horses tied near the corral. Caleb's men scattered to meet them, shouting orders that overlapped into confusion, and gunfire cracked through the dark within seconds. Tom drew 2 of Caleb's riders wide toward the tree line with a whoop and a string of curses meant to pull their attention, while Sheriff Walker moved in low from the far side of the shack, keeping to the shadow of the corral fence. Jack came through the door with his pistol drawn and found Caleb holding Josie by the arm, using her as a shield between them. Let her go, Jack said. This is between you and me. It always was. Is it? You've got the land, the cattle, the name everybody trusts. I've got nothing but what I've built with my own hands while you sat on what your father gave you. Caleb's grip tightened. Draw on me, Mercer. Give the sheriff a reason to bury this whole mess with you in it. I'm not going to shoot a man who's already lost. Josie used the half-second of confusion that followed to drive her elbow hard into Caleb's ribs and twist free, and Sheriff Walker was through the door a heartbeat later with his gun already leveled. It's over, Rusk. Drop it. Caleb looked at the papers Josie had never actually brought with her, at the sheriff's steady aim, at Jack standing calm and unarmed of any need to prove himself, and he understood there was nothing left to threaten his way out of. He dropped the weapon. The truth came out over the following days, plain and undeniable once Sheriff Walker laid it in front of the whole town. Caleb Rusk had been altering Mercer brands for the better part of a year, forging bills of sale to make stolen cattle look legitimate, and using pressure and old grudges to force smaller ranchers off land he wanted for himself. He was arrested and the false records were destroyed in front of witnesses, so no argument could be made that they'd ever meant anything. Sheriff Walker made sure the whole territory understood what had really happened, riding out personally to the neighboring ranches Caleb had been quietly pressuring, so no other family would spend a single extra night afraid of losing land that was rightfully theirs. The brand book at the county office was corrected, the forged bills of sale burned in the street outside the sheriff's office, and for the first time in months, Red Willow talked about something other than rumors. Jack's reputation, which had briefly wobbled under Caleb's accusations, came back stronger than before. So did something else, something that mattered more to him than land or cattle ever had. He found Josie at her father's porch a week later, healing bruises fading from her wrists, Hank sitting nearby pretending not to listen. "I owe you an apology I haven't given properly," Jack said. "For the secrecy. For letting you find out who I was instead of telling you myself." "You already apologized." "Then I owe you something else." He held out a small leather pouch. "A partnership. Not charity, not a reward, not a rich man trying to buy back what he broke. An eating house of your own, built on Mercer land, run entirely by you, on your terms." Josie studied him a long moment. "I don't want to be dependent on you, Jack." "I know. That's why it's yours, not mine. I'm only offering the land and the first month's supplies. Everything after that, you build." She thought about her mother, gone years now, and the years since spent proving to herself and everyone else that she could survive without leaning on anybody. She thought about how accepting help wasn't the same thing as losing herself to it, not if she was the one deciding the terms. A person could build something alongside another person without ever handing over the whole of themselves in the bargain. That was the lesson she'd been circling since the night she counted out $7, and she finally understood it standing on her father's porch with the man who'd once eaten a meal he couldn't pay for. "All right," she said. "Partners." Wade Collins turned out to be the one person in town who couldn't stop retelling the story of the night he'd laughed at a broke cowboy who turned out to own half the frontier, and he told it so often, and so sheepishly, that the whole town eventually forgave him for it, mostly because the story was too good not to enjoy at his expense. Hank Turner finally got to rest in a house with a solid roof and no leaks, and he liked to remind Josie, whenever she visited, that $7 had turned out to be the finest investment either of them ever made. Josie and Jack married the following autumn, in a small ceremony at the ranch with Hank standing proud in a new coat and Tom pretending he hadn't cried during the vows. Their marriage never once rested on what Jack owned. It rested on the same thing it had started with, plain and simple, a woman who did right without checking what it might earn her, and a man who finally understood that trust couldn't be tested into existence, only offered and returned in equal measure. Josie's eating house opened that spring, and it did more business in its first month than Frank Doyle's had done all year, mostly because half the territory wanted to see the place run by the woman who'd once given away her last $7 to a stranger and ended up with a rancher's heart in return. On the day it opened, Jack walked in, sat at the same kind of table where they'd first met, and set $7 down in front of her. "What's that for?" Josie asked. "The most expensive meal I ever ate. It only cost $7. "No," Jack said. "It cost me my pride, my secrets, and eventually my whole heart. $7 was just where it started." Josie picked up the coins and slid them into her apron pocket, the same pocket she'd once emptied for a stranger with nothing to his name but dust and dignity. "Then I suppose you got a bargain," she said. He smiled, and for the first time in years, it wasn't the smile of a man guarding something. It was just Jack. If you want to see how far Josie and Jack's story goes from here, subscribe and stay close, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello and find out how far our story has traveled together.